We're going to do a bit of time travel today back to kind of an understudied period of Tolkien's life, his time at King Edward's School, his time at Exeter College, Oxford, and kind of the cradle of his imagination in a way. So today I'm going to be exploring some intriguing entries in Tolkien's 1917 Gnomish Lexicon, the language of Galdogran, spoken by the Gnomes or Noldoli elves, later known as the Noldor in the Silmarillion, who after their departure from Valinor, following the kinslaying at Alqualande, became exiles. Gnomish, or Galdogran, the Welsh-inspired language that would later be redeveloped into the Sindarin, spoken by the Sindar, or Grey Elves, as well as the elf friends like Frodo and Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, is the second earliest of Tolkien's Elvish languages, the oldest being the Quenya lexicon from about 1915. In relation to the earlier Quenya lexicon, in a 1916 letter, Tolkien confessed to his fiancée, Edith Pratt, that he was working on his nonsense fairy language. Despite the apparent embarrassment regarding working on an invented language, both early lexicons, in fact, not only were not nonsense, as these were carefully developed and structured according to real-world linguistic principles, these also had their share of lexical borrowings from the languages Tolkien was studying during his youth. Some of these have been discussed by scholars of Tolkienian linguistics like Arden Smith and Christopher Gilson, who have identified and discussed both direct and modified borrowings from Old English, Old Saxon, Gothic, and Middle English in the Quenya lexicon. And more recently, Mark T. Hooker, in his book Tolkien's Glossology, illuminates the influence of ancient, medieval, and modern languages on both Tolkien's earliest lexicons. Yet other borrowed lexical items appear to have gone unnoticed, and these will now be considered in the light of the kind of early training and study habits that laid the groundwork for Tolkien's language invention, and specifically the semantic alteration of direct borrowings from Germanic languages. So the close relationship between J.R.R. Tolkien's scholarship and fiction is well known, yet much of the focus on the topic considers his mature years during his tenure as Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon, chair which he held from 1925 to 1945, or his Merton Professorship of English Language and Literature, which he held after holding the Rawlinson and Bosworth chair. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography labels Tolkien as writer and philologist, and the triumvirate of authors of The Ring of Words, Tolkien and the Oxford English Dictionary, call him a uniquely philological writer. Yet what is a philologist, and what does it mean that one so skilled became the eminent fantasy author of all time? The Oxford English Dictionary defines philology as the branch of knowledge that deals with the structure, historical development, and relationships of languages or language families, and the historical study of the phonology and morphology of languages. According to the sense derived from the two Greek words, philos, loving, and logos, word, philology can literally be understood as love of words, which certainly applied to Tolkien's attitudes to both language study and language invention. Brian Rosebery has stated that instruction in Tolkien's philological interests is actually a prerequisite for a full recognition of Tolkien's literary merits. While Tolkien was at the height of his powers during his teaching career, long before that, he was immersed in the languages that contributed to his fame. Tolkien's undergraduate years are very much worthy of attention, as this formative period not only laid the groundwork for his later professional scholarship, but also represented a time of advanced learning during which he studied several languages at once. A young Tolkien was immersed in the historical relationships of the Germanic languages and the developments of the sounds and shapes of their individual lexical items, some of which found their way into his early Elvish lexicons. While still at King Edward's School in Birmingham, where Tolkien studied from 1905 to 1910, he was already studying several languages on the side of his required work in Latin, Greek, German, and French. One of his tutors at the school, George Brewerton, who taught English literature, pleased with Tolkien's interest in Middle English, according to Humphrey Carpenter, quote, offered to loan the boy an Anglo-Saxon primer. Although Carpenter does not name the author of this book, in There and Back Again, Mark Atherton suggests that this was Henry Sweet's Anglo-Saxon primer, or possibly his other remedial textbook, First Steps in Anglo-Saxon. In 1908, a school friend sold Tolkien an unwanted book that he had bought at a missionary sale, Joseph Wright's Primer of the Gothic Language, originally published in 1899, which proved so inspiring that Tolkien started producing Neo-Gothic words in his spare time, not your average teenager. He also began reading Old Norse sagas while at King Edward's and started studying and giving performative readings in the original language. So in total, before Tolkien matriculated at Oxford University, he was studying 8 languages, 9 if counting the rudimentary Spanish he dabbled in. And for this, he was inspired by the heritage of Father Francis Morgan, who was half Spanish. And Tolkien's precocious reading habits would serve him well for his eventual formal studies of Germanic philology after he transferred from literae humaniores, or classics, to English language and literature by the spring or Trinity term of 1913. So it was by this time of year he was doing his first official courses under that. Before that date, however, it proved an unhelpful distraction when he was supposed to be studying Greek philology and other topics from the start of his course in the autumn of 1911. However, even before switching courses, Tolkien took a special option, comparative philology, with Professor of Comparative Philology Joseph Wright, the author of the very Gothic primer that had been such an inspiration during his school days. Ever the linguistic dabbler, Tolkien would foray into languages that were not on his course, and these offered constellations of words that inspired characters, stories, and invented languages. So this is an overview of more or less what he covered during his degree, whether he was supposed to or not. An important part of appreciating a young Tolkien's advanced knowledge is understanding the great erudition of his tutors, especially that of Joseph Wright. Wright's own biography is one of the great Cinderella stories of academia. He had grown up in Yorkshire, working in a mill since age 6, and was illiterate up to the age of 15, at which time he taught himself to read so he could peruse newspapers like everyone else. But he didn't stop there. From there, he went to night school and learned French and German and taught himself Latin. At 21, he sailed to the continent to study at Heidelberg University and later at Leipzig as well, where he became interested in philology and learned both Germanic and Slavonic languages. So you see some of these covered here. So he covered Sanskrit, Gothic, Old Bulgarian, Lithuanian, Russian, Old Norse, Old Saxon, Old and Middle High German, and Old English. He didn't go there and take a nap, basically. These became the bedrock for the many grammars he produced later, which not only consistently provided numerous Germanic cognates, but also, at least in his Gothic primer, some examples of Old Bulgarian and Lithuanian. Wright went on to become professor of comparative philology at the University of Oxford in 1901, succeeding Max Mueller, who had previously held the post, and produced a range of linguistic textbooks, including grammars of Old and Middle English, the first 2 which he actually worked on with his wife, Elizabeth Mary Wright, and also ones in Old High German, Middle High German, and Gothic. In addition, he edited a 6-volume English dialect dictionary. This treasure trove of linguistic knowledge was now accessible to a young Tolkien through direct, in-person instruction from tutorials, as well as through Wright's lectures and books. Oxford's Bodleian Library preserves several of Tolkien's textbooks from both King Edward's School and Exeter College, as well as several of his undergraduate notebooks and papers. These, along with Exeter College's library loan register from the period, reveal much of what Tolkien was reading at this time. Yet even this is not comprehensive. The textbooks of Tolkien's youth are the products of the golden age of philology and are written in such a way in which it is clear that the authors expected more advanced knowledge in the learner than would be expected in the equivalent textbooks of the late 20th and 21st century. This is especially true of the grammars by Joseph Wright and German philologist Edward Sievers, whose Grammar of Old English, that was originally in German, but it was published by Albert Cook in 1903 and translated into English. And that was also owned and used by Tolkien at this time, along with Wright's books. In these grammars, readers are exposed to a veritable barrage of Germanic cognates, etymologies, and dialect variations in Old English. As such, these textbooks are linguistic histories as much as they are pragmatic language learning tools, and are reflections of the period in which they were written. Compare more recent Old English language books like Peter Baker's Introduction to Old English or Mitchell and Robinson's Guide to Old English, where the content and focus are straightforwardly singular. Edwardian era students, and late Victorian as well, beginning to study with these grammars were already polylingual, even if not to the same extent as Tolkien, knowing at least Latin and often also Greek, and at least one modern language, though often two, as was the standard of public schools of that time. At Oxford, Tolkien was already studying Greek philology and comparative philology before switching to the English school, and these factors alone would have made him extremely linguistically adept. Yet, as already discussed, he started learning Gothic, Old English, and Old Norse while still at school, and so his powers of recollection and erudition in language study would have made textbooks like Wright's, that would be much more challenging and even confusing for first-time learners today, much more straightforward, and in Tolkien's case, even easy. From Trinity Term 1913, what Tolkien in a later letter called his boyish hobby of studying Old English became professional. Yet, as Humphrey Carpenter reveals in his biography of Tolkien, after meeting with one of his tutors, Kenneth Sison, who was A.S. Napier's teaching assistant at the time, Tolkien confesses that he was seized with panic because I cannot see how it is going to provide me with honest labor for 2 years and a term. So he had anxiety about having overstudied already, but the course proved more challenging than he thought, but just shows how much he had already read. This, as Carpenter explains, was because Tolkien was already well acquainted with many of the texts he would have read. And this claim is substantiated by the fact that Tolkien's own copy of Henry Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader from 1908, the 8th edition, which is preserved in the Bodleian Library, is inscribed with the date 1911, meaning its use long predates Tolkien's course switch to English. His familiarity with the set texts would have encouraged him to read even more widely. At this time, his study of Old Norse became formalized as he took what was then called the Scandinavian philology paper with philologist and lexicographer William Alexander Craigie, who was Taylorian lecturer in the Scandinavian languages, after which time Craigie was elected Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. Like Wright, Craigie was also a linguistic luminary, born in Dundee, Scotland, after attending St. Andrews University, where he studied classics and philosophy. He was simultaneously learning German, French, Danish, and Icelandic. I think you're starting to get a picture of the types of people who were teaching Tolkien and where he got it from. He then went to Copenhagen to study Scandinavian languages and original medieval Icelandic manuscripts. He later returned to St. Andrews to become assistant professor of Latin, which he served in from 1893 to 97, and joined the Oxford English Dictionary staff, or the New English Dictionary staff, from 1897. From 1905, he was teaching at Oxford University itself. Now that we have examined who taught Tolkien, it is now important to consider the way in which he learned. Multilingual and multi-dialect thinking was encouraged in the lectures and classes he attended as an Oxford undergraduate, as well as in his textbooks. Issues of the Oxford University Gazette from that period record the lecture series Tolkien was attending, including W.A. Craigie's series entitled Old Icelandic Grammar and Philology, with special reference to Old and Middle English. He also attended the lecture series entitled Old English Dialects, given by A.S. Napier, who was Merton Professor of English Language and Literature at the time. And some of Tolkien's notes on this lecture series are preserved in one of his student notebooks in the Bodleian. Tolkien likely also attended lectures on other Germanic languages, like Joseph Wright's on Gothic grammar in Trinity Term 1913, Old High German texts, Michaelmas Term 1914, or Historical German grammar, Trinity Term 1914. Exeter College records show Tolkien checked out Wright's Middle High German grammar as early as 1911. Meanwhile, his undergraduate textbooks, like Henry Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader, Joseph Wright's Old English Grammar, frequently provided variant spellings from the regional dialects of Northumbrian, Kentish, Mercian, and early and late West Saxon. Wright's Old English Grammar also provided Gothic, Old Saxon, Old Icelandic, Old Norse, Old High German, and Proto-Germanic variants, the latter then called Primitive Germanic, so the terminology changes a little bit, as did another of Tolkien's textbooks, Edward Seaver's Grammar of Old English. The impact of the content of these sorts of lectures and textbooks can be identified in Tolkien's own student exercise books, where he produces charts, paradigms, and notes relating to Germanic cognates and Old English dialect variants. At times, in some of his more expansive tables, he even imitates his teacher, Joseph Wright's propensity for drifting into references to Sanskrit or Slavonic. So you knew that that was going to come in at some point. Also surviving from this period are loose sheets of Tolkien's notes detailing continuities and differences between the regional dialects of Kentish, West Saxon, Northumbrian, and Mercian dialects, including some examples from Old Mercian. One incorporates relevant equivalents in West Germanic, Old Saxon, Gothic, and what was called in grammars of the period Primitive Old English, so kind of pre-7th century. Tolkien's textbooks never allowed readers to forget the wider Germanic language family, regardless of whether the main focus was supposed to be Old English or Gothic, as in Wright's books. On these next two slides, you can see the geography and chronology of languages that are frequently referenced in these books. And so you have Proto-Germanic, West Germanic, Gothic, which is the oldest surviving, that's the only representative of East Germanic surviving, Old English, Old Saxon, sometimes called Old Low German, and roughly when they were spoken. So Old Saxon is more contemporary with Old English, Old High German, Middle High German. Again, Old High German is more contemporary with Old English. Middle High German, more contemporary with Late Old English, Early Middle English. Old Icelandic, Old Norse, Old Frisian. So this is what Tolkien read every day, more or less, books that were constantly reminding him of all of these other family members of Old English. Mm-hmm. So in another of his notebooks, Tolkien made a comparative table recording short endings for Proto-Germanic, Proto-West Germanic, Gothic, and Old English, which illustrates how he spent time pondering the historical developments of inflectional morphology. This is when words change form to express changes in tense, number, or case in these languages. The process of making handwritten reproductions of the contents of the grammars he was studying would have still more deeply ingrained multilingual and multi-dialect thinking. And modern research has revealed the significance of a practice that was far from meaningless tedium. There are numerous academic articles, scientific experiments, not to mention many articles in online magazines and YouTube videos about the superior effects of writing by hand over typing for memory, learning, and general cognitive function. Such studies are especially pertinent when considering that Tolkien was writing all his undergraduate notes and essays by hand in the 1910s, and continued to write by hand even when he had access to a typewriter later in life. He did use a typewriter, but oftentimes in the archive you will see versions of the same lecture both in a handwritten draft and in a typescript draft. So he never abandoned writing by hand. The importance of this practice to his philological studies, which had him copying out paradigms for Old English dialects or reproducing those for Germanic cognates, should not be underestimated. Needless to say, the digital age, and still more with the advent of AI, have radically reshaped the learning process and study practices. Yet for Tolkien, the slower, methodical, and ruminative practice of copying by hand was conducive to both a deeper and longer-lasting form of learning, one, of course, also practiced by his contemporaries. The acts of reading and reproducing the carousel of spellings found in Tolkien's textbooks created the ideal cognitive conditions for producing new languages and for integrating elements of old ones into the same. Not to mention, it's a closer kinship with the experience of the medieval scribes as well. So I think that was another thing to kind of remember in that as well. One historical practice Tolkien became very familiar with during his studies was that of lexical borrowing. For instance, certain Old English texts featured borrowings from Old Norse, and Old Norse is purported to have some Old English words incorporated into it, in particular in the poem Völundarkvida, or the Lay of. In one of his likely textbooks for Scandinavian Scandinavian philology, though in Tolkien's minds they were kind of similar, an Icelandic reader, is a short chapter on Scandinavian loanwords in English. It provides a list of Old Norse words that appear in several Old English texts, like the 10th century heroic poem, The Battle of Maldon, the E-version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which largely covers pre-conquest history, and a sermon by the 11th century homilist and Archbishop Wulfstan of York, Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, the sermon of Wolf to the English, and in the laws of that period. Meanwhile, Norwegian philologist Sophus Fuge, whose name recurs in Tolkien's undergraduate notes several times, pointed out the presence of what seems to be Old English words in the Old Norse poem Völundarkvida, as I mentioned, about a vengeful smith who inspired Tolkien's own iteration in Feanor. Tolkien also checked out a 1914 issue of the philological journal Anglia, which featured an article on the Scandinavian element in the English dialects and provided a few of the Germanic variants for elf. That same year, Tolkien also wrote an essay on the Scandinavian influence on English. So this is being encouraged in his classes, his textbooks, and so he's deeply immersed in this topic. In Old English poetry, with the most famous examples coming from Beowulf, the hero is said to word hoard on Leach, unlock his word hoard, a phrase showing the belief that words, especially ones of high quality and consequence, that reveal not only the eloquence, but often the wisdom of the speaker as well, were regarded as of the same value as hoarded treasures. By the time Tolkien produced the Quenya Lexicon in 1915 and the Gnomish Lexicon in 1917, he already had a well-stocked word hoard. And one can understand why, after perusing just a few pages from Joseph Wright's grammars. So this is a page taken from Wright's grammar. This is actually the second edition. And we see a phenomenon of cognate clusters. And you can see that with different words, different variations of the word for dog, hound. So you have Gothic Hunds, Old Icelandic Hundr, Old High German Hund, Old English Hund. And it allows Tolkien and anyone reading it to think about the similarities and differences in the spelling, and again, reinforces the sense of a language family. So now the way Old English is taught and generally learned, it's very singular, very focused on the basic mechanics of the language. But back then, because learners were more advanced, and many of the pages of Wright's books, especially his grammars, are like this. And this would not be acceptable really now, but it is fascinating. And it's something that you can dip into and just kind of enjoy, because it's rather approachable in a way, if you're just looking at these clusters. And so I've given some of the abbreviations. A lot of them are still used today. What is called Old Icelandic in this book and other books of the period, it's normally called either just Old Norse now or Old Norse-Icelandic, but largely similar. And also there are instances of Latin and Greek as well. And again, Tolkien is learning about sound changes and why vowel systems changed over time. And sometimes the word was basically the same in a couple of different languages. So you see where for man, the same in Old English, Old Saxon, and Old High German, Old Icelandic, there, man, and whereas or whereas, that would be the Proto-Germanic. And because it's reconstructed words, so they take attested descendants and they reconstruct the words. In both books of that period and books today, you'll see that little asterisk next to it, which is letting you know that this is a reconstructed word. So moving on from that, long before his time working on the Oxford English Dictionary, or his many years as a professor, this linguistic immersion impacted his earliest invented languages and the related mythology in the Book of Lost Tales, the earliest version of the Silmarillion that was composed mainly between 1917 and 1919. Lexical borrowing was inevitable, but not a lazy act. And this practice reveals much about the process of Tolkien's world building and character invention. His Gnomish lexicon features words that are actually taken from Old English, Old Saxon, and Old Norse. And these lexical borrowings are then given new meanings, which sometimes show ghostly hints of their past ones or of ones from related compound words. And what is the result? We're going to find out. So we're going to peel back the layers today of some of these words and see how the old and the new interact with each other, and also how they contribute to narrative and to character development. These supposedly gnomish words can be thought of as lexical palimpsests. But what does that mean exactly, lexical palimpsests? Well, a palimpsest, more generally, is a recycled manuscript that has an older layer of text underneath the newer one. This can occur in ancient scrolls, medieval codices, and even some contemporary archival material as well, including even Tolkien's own literary drafts. So with Tolkien's, you'll sometimes have a pencil layer and then an ink layer over it. And it would be lovely if we could read that through multispectral lighting, but one day, hopefully. And so this other older layer is sometimes at least partially visible with the naked eye, but often requires techniques like UV or multispectral lighting to make the hidden text fully legible. And we see here another sense of palimpsests in extended use, a thing likened to such a writing surface, in having been reused or altered while still retaining traces of its earlier form, a multi-layered record. And I think it's important to think about that while we're going through these case studies. They are really a multi-layered record. They're direct borrowings, and looking at that older and newer layers is going to make this rich synergy of imagination, which is unique to Tolkien. So in understanding Tolkien's lexical palimpsests, then, words with more than one layer of meaning, we must first identify the origins of the words in question. Are they really invented, or either direct or revised historical borrowings? If the latter, then what were their original meanings, and did these at all inform or interact with the new ones given to them? And what is the benefit of looking back at these original meanings? And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to discuss a few of these case studies, and this is actually going to be a forthcoming publication, so I'm using some of the examples from that, and others will be released at a later date. So the first case study, and I'm going to be putting Gnomish in quotation marks. The first case study is Tungal, which in the Gnomish lexicon is rendered as wise and knowing. Where is this word really come from? Is it Gnomish or is it something else? Some already know the answer to this, others not yet. So Tungal originally is the Old English word for star, planet, or heavenly body. It also closely maps onto the Old Norse word for moon, Tungal, almost exactly the same spelling, depending on the text. Then it goes a little bit deeper than just that word, because what you have in Old English and Old Norse, you have this wonderful phenomenon of compounds and kennings, which are more complex, riddle-like. So one of these compounds is Tungal Wittigan, which very literally translated means star prophets or star seers. And this was used to describe the Magi in any text referring to them. And this lovely tapestry actually hangs in Exeter College Chapel. And it was put up there in 1890. So it was there when Tolkien was an undergraduate, and it's still there. And we're going to see how this is significant. It is depicting the Magi, which is relevant for our theme. It's also very interesting what the angel is holding, and we're going to get to that. So some of the compounds that contain Tungal are clustered together in Henry Sweet's Student's Anglo-Saxon Dictionary, which is in the Bodleian. Tolkien's personal copy survives in the Bodleian. It's very broken up, so you have to handle it carefully. It's obviously used a lot. And it also appears in Alfrich of Eynsham homily on the Nativity of the Innocents. And this was anthologized in Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader and is underlined, so we know that Tolkien read it. It also appears in a couple of versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, even though it is about early English history, it actually starts with biblical history. And so it goes to the birth of Christ, and the Magi are mentioned, and hence Tungal Wittigan is used in that context as well. We also have this lovely word, Tungal gem, which literally means star gem. We also have Tungelkraft, literally starcraft, which can be used for both astronomy and astrology. So this would be the skill that the Magi possess in recognizing the star and what it signified. And I have argued in my thesis, and I'm bringing this in here in this other study, that this tapestry may have been an ancillary visual influence to the famous lines from the Exeter book, from the poem Christ One, Hail Arundel, brightest of angels, sent to men over Middle Earth. And I haven't actually included the text from the Exeter book there. I suspect, this is a possibility, that you'll notice the angel is holding a small light. And I suspect that that little light could have been the inspiration for the Phial of Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings. And closer to this period, this was the period when the Silmarils were invented. And I suspect that this could have been an influence for Tolkien at that time, one of them. All right, so this is another case study number 2. And this one is a rather fun example. It's fun because this is a strange name for an elf. Tolkien normally has more musical, euphonious names like Glorfindel and Ecthelion. So when I read this in The Fall of Gondolin, I thought, this is a strange name for an elf. You'd think maybe for an orc or just any being that's not an elf. And I thought, oh, this is so odd. I mean, they're a battalion of blacksmith elves, so you can understand why he would pick something. But then when I was thinking about it, I realized Rog is an Old Norse word. So in the Gnomish Lexicon, Tolkien gives a new meaning of doughty and strong for this word in Gnomish. Now, its Old Norse version is somewhat akin in sense, but not exactly. And it's also part of many compounds in Old Norse as well. And what I'm going to show on the next slide is going to be very exciting, because we're going to show what Tolkien's mindset was like with this. Okay. So this letter is actually showing a quote that Tolkien was talking about the names in The Lord of the Rings. He says, "To me, a name comes first, and the story follows." But this statement really can apply to his early mythology just as much as it's applicable to The Lord of the Rings, or really any of his writing. So in Old Norse, Rog means strife, war. It can also have a sense of slander, calumny. The first two senses, though, are the most relevant here. So you get phrases like Rog Niflunga, the strife of the Niflungs. And this is actually a kenning for gold. And the word happens to appear in Tolkien's undergraduate list of Old Norse words. So that is hard evidence that he was thinking about this particular word during his undergraduate degree, which were the years leading up to him writing The Fall of Gondolin in 1917 with this figure. So it gets even more fun. There is also the wonderful kenning Rog Alfr, which literally means strife elf. It was a kenning for warrior that appears in Hodatal, which is the enumeration of meters. It's the final major portion of the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson that was set to manuscript in about 1220. So what we have from all of this, the word and then the related kenning, and there were many such with Rog as a first element. What we have is Tolkien's warrior elf, named Rog, who is in a state of war or strife with the forces of Melka, or Melkor Morgoth in the Silmarillion. This is relevant also because in the sense of strife in particular, this kind of feud-like sense, some of the elves in the Hammer of Wrath battalion had actually been thralls at one point in Melko's Angband. And so in their warfare, it's not only defensive as with the other battalions, but there's also a sense of getting even from some of their past experience. And so we see this is a very kind of easier to chart example how Tolkien's undergraduate studies directly came into his early mythology. So now we're going to go on to Gnomish case study 3. This isn't going to be an endless litany. This is the second to last one. So this one, the previous one has laid the groundwork for this a little bit. So the entries in the Gnomish Lexicon relating to Balrog, you have Bale, cruel, directly connected with Balrog in that context. Bal, anguish. Balrog in the Gnomish lexicon is defined as a kind of fire demon, creatures and servants of Melko. And it also relates to the Old English, Bal, fire, flame, funeral pyre. And we see the later Sindarin use of it, which changes it to demon of might, with Bal standing for power and Rog, demon. Now, if we think of this, however, in the Old Norse context, this gets very interesting. Old Norse Bal means a flame. And if you think of it as two Old Norse words put together, and this doesn't have to be exclusive, Tolkien is very layered in what he does. You have Bal, flame, plus Rog, strife, war, flame, war. So why is that relevant other than just putting two Norse words together that sound generally relevant? Well, interestingly, Balrogs are akin to Surtur and the other fire giants known as the sons of Muspel, who are against the Aesir at Ragnarok, or the doom of the gods. So they are antagonists who join forces with Loki and other giants and Midgard serpent. And so they are part of the enemies. And so by looking at the word in an Old Norse context, we can see how it's not just putting two Old Norse words together, but it's bringing in a mythological element as well. And this is the last case study for today. I've saved this one for last because it's a little bit more complex, but I hope it will be enjoyable. It is concerning the Gnomish word alpha, which in the Gnomish lexicon is defined as swan. There happens to be a fairly similar Old Norse word, alft, swan, but there's more to this word. Tolkien is very layered, even in his borrowings. It's also very close, minus the long vowel, to the Old Norse plural alva, elves, also akin to Old Saxon alf. And one scholar, not relating it to Tolkien's works, but there is a scholar who has suggested that there may have been an early Northumbrian, that's one of the Old English dialects, there may have been an early Northumbrian version that has it as Alfie. So this is interesting. We have swan as the meaning Tolkien puts, but it looks a lot like these words for elves. So let's explore this further. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to think about the themes of swans and elves, elegy and exile. We're going to see why these elements come together in a very poignant way. So we have rather close Proto-Germanic words, a little pair, of albaz, elf, and albetes, swan. You have an Old English equivalent pair in ilfet, swan, and ulf, elf. Ulf is actually the late West Saxon version, and it actually appears in Beowulf in the plural form, Ylva, as one of the groups of monsters who are descended from the brother slayer Cain. So the man-eater Grendel is descended from Cain, and these other groups of monsters, including Ylva, are descendants of Cain as well. Interestingly, Tolkien got a little bit sensitive about this. He actually takes out the reference to elves in his prose translation of Beowulf, because he had reconstructed the image of elves, and so it's very interesting that he does that. So thinking about elves and swans, you have this linguistic element. You also have this beautiful context in the elegiac poem The Seafarer in the Exeter book, which is about a lonely exile who hears the Ylfet song, swan's song, while at sea. So Tolkien is thinking about elements of elves, swans, exile, with some inflection of kinslaying as well in this context. So we're going to think about the kinslaying of Alqualonde, which is a seismic event in the history of the First Age in the Silmarillion. It is of equal importance in the earliest version, the Book of Lost Tales. But we're going to think about this episode through the lens of these word pairings and what it does reading that narrative through the lens of these texts. So in the Book of Lost Tales, the haven of the Solosympi, who later are replaced by the Teleri in the Silmarillion, they're the seafaring elves that live by the sea, and they produce these lovely swan ships, which you see here. And after Melkor has committed his crimes in Valinor, killing Feanor's father, destroying the two trees, stealing the Silmarils, the Noldoli, or the Noldor, and Feanor seek revenge, and to pursue him, they require these ships to cross the sea, which are owned by the Solosympi, later the Teleri. And the Solosympi, or the Teleri later, do not agree to this, and they fight each other for the ships, and this leads to what is known as the first kinslaying. And it's a very fateful event for the Noldoli, or later Noldor especially. This leads to them being put under the doom of Mandos, and they are exiled from Valinor. This is very interesting because you remember those connection of Ylva and kinslaying by being descended from Cain. I think that's coming in here along with some slight echoes of the seafarer. So the harbor in the Book of Lost Tales is called Copus Alqualonte, Haven of the Swans. In the Quenya Lexicon, Alqua is the word for swan, and it equates with the Gnomish lexicon's alva, also recalling that, of course, there is the Norse word alva, elves. And in the margin of his father's manuscript, Christopher Tolkien has pointed out, this is in the manuscript of the Book of Lost Tales, that Tolkien has put down the Old English title Ylfet Huth, which is the combination of the Old English word Ylfet, swan, and Huth, haven. And it's interesting to note that Ylva, with this spelling, is actually the early West Saxon word for elf, not in this actual title, that's the word for swan. But again, in the different dialects, you have this pairing of the word for elf and a similar word for swan. So let's just, in closing, think about that. In the chapter, The Flight of the Noldoli, in the Book of Lost Tales, it says, they, this is the Noldoli, slew them bitterly, or cast them into the sea. And so first perished the Eldar neath the weapons of their kin. The haven is dark and very still, save for the faint sound of tears. And now let's look at it in the context of the poem with the swan song. How I, wretched and sad, on the ice-cold sea, dwelt for a winter, on the paths of the exile, deprived of dear kinsmen. Sometimes the swan song I had for my entertainment. So we have themes, parallel themes of exile, being deprived of kinsmen. The Sol Simpi, Lady of the Teleri, are distant kinsmen. However, some of the Noldoli and Noldor remain in Valinor. Then many others go to the Great Lands and the Lost Tales, which later becomes Middle Earth in the later texts. And so many of the themes here in the Seafarer are coming in to this important episode in Tolkien's mythology. So in closing, I think some of these Gnomish examples, quote unquote Gnomish, are important in considering why Tolkien was unique. There were many learned philologists before him and who were contemporaries, but Tolkien was distinct for the reasons set out in some of these quotes from Carpenter's biography and also this one from Alan Bliss. Strange as it may seem, it was undoubtedly the source of that unparalleled richness, this is talking about his philology, and concreteness, which later distinguished him from other philologists. He had been inside language. And I think we can appreciate that statement more. It's a pretty famous statement, but I think having gone through some of the textbooks he was looking at and the vast knowledge of the people who were teaching him, we can understand that statement more. Then these next two quotes go a little bit deeper. So it continues later, in this respect, he almost founded a new school in philology. Certainly there had been no one before him who brought such humanity, one might say, such emotion to the subject. Now, even though Carpenter here is talking about the context of Tolkien's teaching, and he would bring great pathos and energy to his lecturing, he would start out mumbling, and that would frustrate people very greatly. Then he would recite Beowulf, and he'd become another man, and it was like a different person came out. But I think that this quote is also equally, if not more pertinent, to the very poignant applications of his philology, which we saw in comparison of the words for elf and swan, comparing the seafarer with the kinslaying of Alqualande. Because what Tolkien brought, as Alan Bliss says, is a unique blend of philological erudition and poetic imagination, distinguishing him from other scholars. And it not only distinguished him from other scholars, I would add it distinguishes him from other fantasy authors, not only in that he was far more learned and knowledgeable, but he applied that knowledge in a way very different from his tutors, including Joseph Wright. It was informed by his tragic personal experiences on the Western Front, the loss of his parents, the loss of his closest friends, and a sensitivity to mythology and philology and how they could be blended not only in a practical way, but in a poignant, memorable, lasting way that goes beyond scholarship or usually the usual kind of fiction that we see. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it.